Hello. It is 3 minutes past. I expect we'll continue to see people finding their way in, but I want to make sure we get started because we have so much to talk about. Welcome. My name is Imogen Hart. Thank you for being here. It is terrific to see so many people here. This event celebrates the publication of 2 new books on 19th century interiors by John Holmes and Andrea Wolk-Reger. Thank you,
can't hear
John
anything she is saying.
And Andrea, for being here and for sharing your work with us. This event is co-organized by 2 societies, the William Morris Society in the United States and the Historic Interiors Group of the Society of Architectural Historians. This is the first collaboration between these 2 groups, and it's wonderful to see members of both groups here in the audience. Many people in both groups have worked hard to make this event possible, so thank you very much to all of those. A few house rules: please keep your microphone on mute, and please do add your questions to the chat at any time. And when we come to the Q&A section, we'll go through those questions and invite you to speak, or you can also we can read your questions for you. So be listening, be noting down your questions and adding them to the chat. Also, this meeting is being recorded and we do plan eventually to post it online. The event will begin with presentations from John and Andrea, who will introduce their books, and then we'll move into a conversation with members of HIG and the William Morris Society, including the president of the William Morris Society, Jude Nixon, and my fellow member of the Events and Conferences Committee of HIG, Tim Rohan. And then we'll also invite the questions and comments that you've shared in the chat from the audience. And at the very end, we will have some information about HIG and the William Morris Society. We will tell you how to become a member, and we'll share some information about events that are upcoming. So please stay tuned at the end for that. So without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. And I will not read their full bios. What I will do instead is to paste them into the chat so that you can read about their achievements. I will simply tell you that John Holmes is Professor of Victorian Literature and Culture at the University of Birmingham and an Honorary Associate of Oxford University Museum of Natural History, and that Andrea Wolk-Reger is the Jessie Hawk Shearer Associate Professor in the Department of Art History and Art at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. John and Andrea, it's wonderful to have you. Thank you for participating. I am going to make both John and Andrea the co-hosts so that they can share their screens, and I will ask John, if when you're ready, to share your screen with us and begin your presentation.
Okay, I'm just about to share screen. Can I just ask people to mute if they haven't already? I think possibly. Perfect, brilliant. Okay, let me try sharing screen. Here we go. And that should get us to the slideshow. Imogen, can I just ask you to give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and see the presentation okay? Perfect. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see everybody. So today I'm going to be talking about this book. Well, in fact, I can also show it to you. This book here, Temple of Science, the Pre-Raphaelites at Oxford University Museum of Natural History, which was published by the Bodleian in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. The research for this emerged from a previous book that I did, which was called The Pre-Raphaelites and Science, which was published by Yale and the Paul Mellon Foundation in 2018, and a chapter of that was about this museum. So this book is a sort of broader popularization of some of the ideas that I looked at there in that previous work. So what I want to do today is talk you through things about the museum itself. This is the museum, that's its facade and its wonderful interior, which I'm mainly going to be concentrating on from the central court. That's Benjamin Woodward in the top corner. He was the lead architect. It was built 1855 to 1860. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the history of the museum and its origins, and particularly focusing on the questions of architectural style and the use of the arts. But I'm going to do that within the same sort of structure that I do in the book. So the title of the book, Temple of Science, comes from this quotation from Charles Daubeny, who was professor of chemistry and professor of botany at Oxford University, and one of the leading campaigners to have this museum built. The museum, by the way, was built to be the first science faculty for Oxford University. So it's not simply a museum in the terms in which we usually understand it. And you can see from this quotation here that Daubeny is envisaging the museum as a temple of science with its central court as a sanctuary. He's framing this in terms of natural theology, the view that there is an author of the universe and that the study of science is the study of that author's work, and that the scientists themselves are, as it were, priests of science, but also thereby implicitly priests of God, the Christian God. So within the book, the first maybe third of it is a kind of historical discussion of how the museum came to be built, the architectural and art influences and debates involved in that. So I'll give you a little rehearsal of some of those key arguments now. Now I have a slight problem, which is being able to see these slides properly. Luckily, I've got them here with me as well, so I can read some of the quotations. So one of the key questions was, what would be an appropriate style for building a science faculty, a museum of science, a museum of natural history? And the dominant perspective was that whatever style it was going to be, it should not be Gothic. The logic being essentially that Gothic was associated with the Middle Ages, whereas science was enlightened, it was modern, it was, if anything, a Renaissance and an 18th century imperative. So in that sense, the argument tended to be that you should aim for a classical style, or perhaps maybe an Elizabethan or early Renaissance style at best, earliest, but certainly not Gothic. And you can see this position being argued here by James Ferguson, the critic, and by Richard Owen, who was the leading museum scientist of his day. But a counter-argument was made, and it was made most particularly by George Street, who was the diocesan architect in Oxford at the time. Street made three arguments in favour of Gothic, and they were essentially these. Firstly, that actually the Gothic arch was the most advanced engineering technology in architectural terms that was available. In other words, to view Gothic as retrograde was to ignore its engineering potential. Secondly, and this is the third part of this quotation here, Gothic was predominantly religious architecture, and therefore if this was going to be a natural theological museum, using Gothic was appropriate. And finally, and most crucially, this museum was going to represent the natural world, and therefore you should choose an architectural style that had always been engaged in representing the natural world, always involved nature in its decorations, is Gothic. The crucial divide here is between people who are thinking about the associations of an architectural style in terms of its period. Owen, Ferguson, the people who are rejecting Gothic as not scientific, and those who are actually thinking about it in terms of its practical forms, both its engineering potential and its potential to represent nature. And it's that latter position that came to dominate, that won out. Here's a really important moment comes when Henry Ackland, who was one of the other leading scientific campaigners, he was to become the Regius Professor of Medicine. He chose to back Gothic. And he framed it in these terms. So this is a speech that he gave to the Oxford Architectural Society on the 13th of June, 1855, just before the foundation stone was laid. Oxford, he said, was about to perform an experiment. It was about to try how Gothic art could deal with those railway materials, iron and glass. And Ackland was convinced that when the interior of this court of this museum was seen with its roof of glass supported by shafts of iron, while the pillars and columns around were composed of variously coloured marbles illustrating different geological strata and ages of the world, and the capitals represented the several descriptions of floras, that it would be felt that problems had been solved of the greatest importance to architecture. What I want you to notice about this, this little quotation is the density of scientific expression and ideas. The building was designed to be an expression of modern science as it was understood in the 1850s. So the whole thing is framed as an experiment, an exercise in experimentation, a testing of problems, a pursuing of solutions. It was going to epitomize engineering and modern engineering in those use of those railway materials, iron and glass, which you can see in this fantastic image of the central court here, particularly the structure of the roof. But it was also going to be an encyclopedia of both geology and botany. You can just see on that image there, I hope, that there are individual columns around both levels of the court. Each column is a single sample of marble. Between them, they represent an encyclopedia of the geology of the British Isles. And carved at the top of the columns is a botanical encyclopedia. The herbarium was going to be elsewhere. So to learn and teach about botany, you needed to have it illustrated in the art, in the fabric of the museum. So you have an extraordinary innovation here, which is the idea of building a museum that can express science in its very form and its materials. And art was going to play a crucial role in this too. This is another key quotation from Ackland a little bit later, where he's talking about the ornament, the use of ornament. He says, "We've sought to hinder all ornament unless that ornament be free from vicious carelessness, and to stop all professing transcript of nature unless it be painstaking, sagacious, and honest. Herein," Ackland says, "we owe a just debt of gratitude to the young school of artists called, half in jest, Pre-Raphaelites." So what you have is a radical art movement of the time, Pre-Raphaelitism, being picked up by actually deeply establishment scientists, or at least scientists at a deeply establishment institution, Oxford University, as a means to communicate science. And the scientists themselves, of course, were working against the grain of the establishment. It took a lot of persuading for Oxford to have a science faculty at all. This is it's just one example. I'll show you some more in a moment of the beautiful decorative art at this museum. This is a capital representing pickerel by John O'Shea, one of the O'Shea brothers who came over from Ireland with Woodward and the architectural practice. And you can see the amazing layering of this sculpture and the beautiful delicacy of it, and that wonderful way in which that bird picks up on the forms of the plants that are represented. So you have this attention to detail that mirrors attention to detail in Pre-Raphaelite painting. And Ackland was very familiar with Pre-Raphaelite painting because he was an old university friend of John Ruskin. And indeed, it was Ackland who held the easel at the moment when John Everett Millais put the first dot of paint on this famous portrait of John Ruskin, the background of which was painted at Glenfinlas in Scotland, where the three of them were on holiday with their families, or I mean, in Ruskin's case, Ruskin's wife, who later became Millais' wife, of course. So he was well aware, Ackland was well aware of the minute detail of Pre-Raphaelite painting. And he will also have been aware of the extent to which the Pre-Raphaelites themselves, in their art theory, invoked science as a model for their art practice. You can see this in two quotations from members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in early essays that they wrote in the early 1850s. Stevens here is talking about how art can model itself on the sciences by pursuing experiment, by adhering to fact, and that can help mobilize the moral purposes of the art. So William Rossetti here, you can see, is using the same sort of scientific vocabulary, I mean, talking about data of facts, investigation, and so forth. So what I do in that first historical chapter then is really talk about how the museum came to be built, how it came to be built in Gothic, how it brought together this extraordinary collaboration between pre-Raphaelite artists and scientists. And of course, Ruskin was at the hinge of that. What I then do in the rest of the book, and what I'll do in the rest of this short talk, is give you a tour of the museum. So chapter 2 is on the facade, and this concentrates on the entrance. This is the main entrance to the museum, designed by John Hungerford Pollen, who was an artist associated with the Pre-Raphaelites. You can see there the design, which is still held at the museum. And you can see how the design was and wasn't executed. Elements of the design were never carved. The days of creation at the bottom there, up there, the columns, for example, conveniently enough for a museum that would later embrace evolution, were never carved. The angel at the top there was carved, but was subtly changed. So if you look at the design, the angel is holding two books, the book of God, the Bible, and the book of nature, that old medieval symbol for nature as a readable document, sign of a creator. The angel, as he's actually carved, though, is holding one book, the Bible, and on the other hand is holding a disc representing dividing cells. Cell theory was absolutely cutting-edge science. The museum opens in 1860, which is the same year that Rudolf Virchow's book, Cellular Medicine, is translated into English. The book itself is published in 1858, 2 years earlier. So that's the point when cell theory starts to come into medicine. It's only really devised in the 40s in German-speaking Europe. And of course, cell theory is also the moment that botany and zoology become unified, but it becomes apparent that plants and animals have the same basic structures. So absolutely cutting-edge science, yet framed overtly in a natural theological context. The other element of the facade that I attend to is the windows. And here, the key designer is John Ruskin. Ruskin did a portfolio of 12 designs for the windows, one of which, based on 3 designs, in fact, was carved very closely to that design, as you can see here, by James O'Shea, brother of John. Others of the windows incorporated elements from some of Ruskin's designs. You can see here how that bird in the middle of the beautiful design on the left has been inverted, its head raised, but stands in the middle of that window there on the right, and several other elements of that window are also Ruskinian. So that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, we go into the central court, looking at elements of the decoration there. This is Francis Skidmore, who oversaw the iron work on the roof, and again, a lot of that illustrated botany. I'll talk about if you have any questions about the roof, I can tell you. In the aftermath, I might tell you about how it fell down, but you'll have to ask me about that because I haven't got room for that now. And then the work of the O'Sheas. Again, the decorative carving, that is James O'Shea carving on the outside of the building. This is one of his carvings, the date palm, and you can see how it's been modified from this design by one of the scientists, John Phillips. O'Shea has populated that date with a whole ecology of animals. Some of the designs were done by women, so that the capital on the left here is probably based on a design by Pauline Trevelyan, one of Ruskin's associates and friends, and a patron of the arts as well as an artist in her own right. We know that Josephine Butler, the pioneering feminist, did a design for arum lilies. It may or may not have found its way into this sculpture that represents the same plant here in the museum itself. We simply don't know because the designs themselves don't exist anymore. The actual practice for the most part for the O'Sheas, though, was that they brought plants from the botanic gardens to carve in situ. We have this testified to by at least 2 or 3 different sources. This is another of James O'Shea's, the wonderful representation of here of leather ferns and the way they're unfurling in front of our very eyes. This is, in Ackland's terms, pre-Raphaelite sculpture that follows the principles of pre-Raphaelitism. But the pre-Raphaelites themselves were also involved directly, principally in carving the portrait statues around the central court, which are the subject of another chapter of the book. These are 3 of my favorite ones. Thomas Woolner, who was a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, his Francis Bacon, John Lucas Tupper, one of their mentors, his Linnaeus, and Alexander Munro, another sculptor in their circle, who did 6 of the statues here, but his Galileo is one of them. The things I'd point out about these statues that makes them so rare and unique among among portrait sculpture in the 19th century, monumental portrait sculpture particularly, is 2 things. One is the extraordinary pre-Raphaelite attention to detail. You can see that in Linnaeus's clothes. He's out there in the field gathering specimens, so he's wrapped up extremely warm. You can see it in Bacon's ruff as well, for example. But the other is the animation. These are scientists doing science. They're scientists in the act of, as I say, in the case of Linnaeus doing field work. Bacon is explaining something to us. Look at the gesture of his hands. Galileo is not shown posed with a telescope. He's shown inventing the telescope. He has these two lenses and he's looking and thinking, how do I need to position them? How is it going to work? So they're scientists doing science, but they're scientists doing science as exercises of the imagination. So the scientist here is an artist. So you have a sort of threefold circle of compliments. The pre-Raphaelites pay tribute to science as a model for their arts. Ackland picks that up, pays tribute to the pre-Raphaelitism by adopting it as a language, visual language for communicating science. And then the pre-Raphaelites return the compliment once again by imagining the scientist as an artist. There's a chapter 2 on some of the other rooms in the building, framed in terms of building different disciplines. This is actually an imagined, it's a drawing by Woodward, imagining a meteorological observation platform on the tower, which was not built. But I have a section on the murals in the geology lecture room, for example, which are still there. And you can see a trace by which, the process by which Richard St. John Tyrwhitt took a daguerreotype by Ruskin, turned it into an oil painting, and then reimagined the same scene for his mural. And also on the Entomological Museum, we've got sculpture by Edward Whelan, who was a nephew of the O'Sheas. We've got very elegant decorative work by a man called Swan, and there's some dispute as to who Swan actually was. The most recent research on that actually slightly supersedes some of the stuff in my book, but you can see how plant decoration is transforming in front of your eyes into insects in this entomology room. The penultimate chapter of the book is about how the museum confronted Darwin. Famously in 1860, there was a debate there among many participants, but the most high profile were the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, and the scientist Thomas Henry Huxley about the implications of Origin of Species. Several years later, though, or several decades later, in fact, 4 decades later, Darwin himself joined the pantheon of statues. So the museum gradually makes peace with evolution. And the final chapter is about the legacy. One of the people, of course, who was in Oxford at the moment that the museum started being built, was working closely with George Edmund Street much the same time, worked with all of the, with Woodward and Rossetti and other people involved in building the museum, in working on the Oxford Union, was William Morris. And you can see, I think, how William Morris's emergent decorative art and his decorative aesthetic looks back in some ways to the museum. You'd get a better sense of that if you were to see several more of the carvings, because they show you different degrees of stylization, which Morris picks up on. But you have that same ecological imperative, that same sinuous stylization and working with plants. The other element of the legacy, though, is that this is the building that sets the pattern for Natural History Museum architecture. Most obviously, the Natural History Museum in London. Owen, having repudiated Gothic, then rather changed his tune, although it's Romanesque. Technically, you have the same medieval models and emphasis on a decorative schema that depends on representing the natural world through invocations of medieval work. If you're interested in the contrast between the two museums, I discuss it at length in the Pre-Raphaelites and Science, but this carries on forward. Stephanie Jovanovich-Kruspel has shown that the Vienna Museum, where you see these extraordinary caryatids and the use of painting, also was influenced by the Oxford Museum, and I think we can see it carrying forward to the use of natural forms in contemporary museums, San Francisco here, and the Michael Lee Chin Crystal at the Royal Ontario Museum. So I hope I've shown you then that this museum is not only an extraordinary treasury of Pre-Raphaelite art in sculptural and architectural and pictorial form, it also represents a unique collaboration between scientists and artists working hand in glove, and has an extraordinary and intensive legacy. So, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful. I will now hand over to Andrea Andrea Wiltwager is the Jesse Hawkes Shearer Associate Professor in the Department of Art History and Art at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, for those of you who weren't here when I introduced her a few minutes ago. And Andrea, whenever you're ready, please do share the screen.
Okay, thank you so much, John, and thank you, Imogen, Jude, and Tim for organizing this event and inviting me to speak with you today. So can everyone hear me okay? See the screen okay? No weird bars or anything? Okay.
Looks good.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so in 1975, the scholar and curator John Christian organized the first substantial exhibition devoted to the Victorian painter and decorative artist Edward Burne-Jones in more than 4 decades. Sponsored by the Arts Council of Great Britain and debuting at the Hayward Gallery in London, the exhibition strove to bring new attention to the artist after a long period of critical disregard. Christian concluded his introduction with a quotation from one of the artist's letters that has now become the canonical description of the art and reputation of Burne-Jones. It is often quoted, but I cannot do better than repeat it here and let it find its own reaction. Quote, "I mean by a picture a beautiful romantic dream of something that never was, never will be, in a light better than any light ever shone, in a land no one can define or remember, only desire, and the forms divinely beautiful." A little over 20 years later, Christian and Stephen Wildman curated an even more extensive international exhibition, Edward Burne-Jones, Victorian Artist Dreamer, in 1998. When the show opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the same quotation was transcribed directly onto the wall at the start of the exhibition. Seizing on these words, the reviewers of the exhibition frequently cited them as evidence of Burne-Jones's irrelevance to 19th century avant-garde art. More recently, the passage resurfaced yet again in critical reviews of the monographic exhibition on the artist Edward Burne-Jones, Pre-Raphaelite Visionary, on view at Tate Britain in 2018. It is not difficult to see why the quotation appealed to Christian, as well as those seeking an efficient and often dismissive way to encapsulate Burne-Jones's career and classify his work. Beginning with the overt statement, "I mean by a picture," the passage promises a declaration of intent, an artist simply summarizing, in his own words, the aims of his artistic practice. Moreover, a beautiful romantic dream conforms to the superficial expectation of Burne-Jones's work and arguably the fantasy genre more broadly. The assertion accords with the perception of Burne-Jones as an artist who turned his back on modernity in order to depict a languid world of fairy tales and mythic heroes dressed up in the garments of the past. The source and accuracy of this quotation, as it has been circulated, has been taken as self-evident. However, extracted from its original context, this truncated quotation belies the seriousness of purpose and dedication with which Burne-Jones pursued his artistic career, as well as the radical potential for his work to challenge viewers. Tracing the origins of the passage reveals one of the ways that Burne-Jones's legacy and artistic practice have been subtly but significantly distorted over the years. The quotation most often appears in the shortened form used by Christian. However, it first emerged in print a year after Burne-Jones's death in a catalog of his drawings and studies published by the Burlington Fine Arts Club. And you can see there's a little bit more of the quotation here. But the original passage, actually it was, I think I cut that slide, sorry. Anyway, here's the original passage. So as I discovered when I traced back this game of art historical telephone to its source, it derives from a letter to Helen Mary Gaskell, now held in the British Library. The letter is undated, but Burne-Jones notes that it's a Sunday and describes his lifelong friend and colleague, William Morris, drawing, quote, an initial letter for the Chaucer, which locates it during the 1892 to 96 production of the Kelmscott Press edition of the works of Geoffrey Chaucer. The surviving correspondence begins mid-letter with Burne-Jones relating an episode from earlier in the day when Morris was vehemently protesting about the destruction of an ancient hornbeam in Epping Forest to clear land for a golf course, ever the environmentalist. Burne-Jones then responds to an apparent question from Gaskell about whether he likes to paint portraits. The artist replies that he only cares for portraits of those he loves. Otherwise, he perceives their value as limited to private domestic use. The now famous statement follows directly on from this critique. Quoted here in full, Burne-Jones writes, quote, "I mean by a picture, a beautiful romantic dream of something that never was nor will be, in a light better than any light that ever shone, in a land no one can define or remember, only desire, and the forms divining beautiful. And then I wake up with the waking of Brunhild. And do you remember what she said when she woke up? I'm sadly afraid you have forgotten what she said, so have I. Only she said everything that was meet, and the burnie was ripped, and she stood on the hill and remembered and foresaw." Two key elements were lost when this quotation was shortened and excerpted. First, Burne-Jones follows his description of a picture as, quote, "a beautiful romantic dream," with the declaration, "Then I wake up." In other words, artistic practice and experience may serve as a conduit to an ideal utopian vision, but that dream state is understood as necessarily ephemeral. The manner of waking is also imperative to parsing this statement, as Burne-Jones invokes the legend of Brunhild. Aware that his reference to a Norse character in the medieval Volsunga saga might be obscure, even for Gaskell, Burne-Jones continues on in the letter to explain the circumstances of Brunhild's awakening. A shield maiden cursed by Odin into a magic sleep, she is awoken by the hero Sigurd, who frees her from a chainmail shirt or burnie. Brunhild then sits beside Sigurd, looking out over an expansive landscape, and reveals the prophetic vision that unfolded during her long slumber. Stretching across the remaining 4 pages of the letter, Burne-Jones carefully copies out verbatim the account of Brunhild's dream as given by Morris in the story of Sigurd the Volsung and the fall of the Nibelungs, filling the recto and verso of each sheet. This close attention to Morris's exact description of the episode demonstrates Burne-Jones's intimate familiarity with the work of his collaborator, as well as his sympathy with Brunhild's dream. Morris portrays Brunhild as a powerful oracular figure, inflecting her vision with imagery evocative of the heavenly Jerusalem. Through Brunhild, Morris offers the reader a sweeping description of heaven and earth, encompassing past, present, and future. By invoking Brunhild's prophetic dream vision as a means of elucidating his concept of a picture, Burne-Jones complicates his seemingly straightforward proclamation earlier in the letter. If his art is a beautiful romantic dream, it is also a transitory, transformative state. The forms divining beautiful create a remove from the mundane, but only a temporary one. The immersive experience of the dream is vital, but equally crucial is the necessity of awakening and sharing that revelatory encounter. Like Brunhild, the dreamer must wake up, remember, and foresee. What Burne-Jones, quote, meant by a picture then was the creation of an alternative space indicting the status quo, not as an escape, but as a site of salvation. Challenging the dominant characterization of Burne-Jones as an artist who withdrew from the Victorian world into imaginary realms of his own creation, my book demonstrates that he was instead engaged in a fundamentally radical defiance of the artistic, social, and political hierarchies of the modern age, including protesting against utilitarianism, industrialization, imperialism, capitalist acquisitive materialism, and a pervasive disregard for the sanctity of the natural world and the suffering of collective humanity. As a young student at Oxford, witnessing the building of the museum, Burne-Jones first began to rebel against these injustices, vowing to embark on what he termed his, quote, crusade and holy warfare against the age, the heartless coldness of the times. After declaring that he would abandon a Christian ministry for the secular ministry of art, his protest against the age took the form of immersive, epiphanic aesthetic experiences. Adopting the medieval concept of dreams as visionary states of transformation, Burne-Jones hoped to reveal the utopian power of embodied aesthetic encounters, not as a retreat, but as a vehicle for revolutionary awakening. Dissatisfied with the London art market, which privileged the portable, easily commodified oil on canvas medium, Burne-Jones continually sought to exceed the established parameters of painting, either through executing colossal individual works or through expansive multi-work cycles. Moreover, he pursued opportunities not only to resist the established artistic supremacy of painting, but also to generate site-specific, immersive environments through the decorative arts. Although it is often overshadowed by his painting practice, Burne-Jones was a prolific designer for the decorative arts, including book illustration, mosaic, stained glass, tapestry, and bas-relief sculpture. This book will recenter his work in the decorative
Look at the others and see if that.
Yeah. The only thing is with some of them, I kind of missed that deadline.
Right.
Their,
Right.
microphone? Sorry. Okay, this book will recenter his work in the decorative arts.
Email with specific questions.
That's what I would do, yes.
Consistently interrogated the boundaries of artistic media, in keeping with wider debates over the role of the arts in the 19th century. Each chapter investigates the use of different artistic media, introducing case studies in his experimentation with book illustration, the single monumental canvas, the multi-part painted series, mosaic, and finally, stained glass, tapestry, and paintings in dialogue. Crucial to my argument is a re-examination of Burne-Jones's supposed schism with Morris over socialism. I posit that their divergence was unequivocally one of methods, not beliefs, thereby returning the profound artistic and intellectual collaborative partnership to the core of Burne-Jones's career. When Morris turned to socialist activism, Burne-Jones supported his radical ideological stance, but disapproved of his impatience and the tangentious factionalism that quickly embroiled his friend. For Burne-Jones, the petty bickering and bureaucratic haggling of politics was ephemeral. Unlike the politics of tracts and pamphlets, art could endure, speaking not only to the present, but to the future as well. Adhering to his calling as a painter and decorative artist rather than a poet and orator, Burne-Jones expressed his deeply held convictions through the vital language of the visual arts.
I am on.
And I'm going to provide just a brief overview of my 5 chapters now. So my first chapter centers on when Adam delved in Eve's Span, Burne-Jones's iconic composition for the frontispiece to the 1892 Kelmscott Press edition of Morris's socialist novel, A Dream of John Ball. Although this woodcut was one of the most widely circulated and readily recognizable of Burne-Jones's works, even transformed into a socialist banner, it has generally been considered to belong more to Morris and his political ideology. I demonstrate that the composition did not originate in Morris's text, but represents a continuous iconographic thread that can be traced throughout the course of Burne-Jones's career. To one of his very first designs, a stained glass window executed in 1857 for James Powell and Sons, depicting Adam and Eve after the fall. Through an exploration of this nuanced image of egalitarianism and an empowered labor, I elucidate Burne-Jones's personal relationship to socialism and radical politics, as well as detailing his involvement with the Eastern Question Association and the conditions of his supposed schism with Morris over political activism. The labors of Adam and Eve emerged from Burne-Jones's image not as a curse, but as a means of redemption, a mandate to the people of the 19th century to achieve salvation through a return to the kind of satisfying physical labor and pleasurable handicraft embodied by this icon of primitive humanity. Burne-Jones's monumental painting, King Cophetua and the Beggar Maid, as seen at the Paris Universal Exposition of 1889, serves as the focus of my second chapter. Set against the backdrop of this concentrated and frenzied microcosm of urban modernity, industrial consumerism, and imperialist propaganda, King Cophetua achieved a striking air of immediacy, proving confrontational and epiphanic. As a painting that blatantly overturned the social order, that employed an ancient legend to call attention to the modern obsession with materiality, and that proclaimed the nature of its making, King Cophetua and the Beggar Maid depicted a multi-layered vision of what might be, of a world rooted in fellowship rather than acquisition, in which beauty can be set free for all. King Cophetua, I argue, functioned as a secular altarpiece that flouted the modern art market and exhibition system. inviting the viewer to cross the threshold of the painting and enter an immersive and transformative encounter with decorative materiality. It was a potent site-specific disruption of the gallery space and a visual manifesto of craft practice as a rebellious act. The third chapter examines the Perseus series as a revival of the Renaissance paragone for modernity, exploring the productive tension between sculpture and painting, the haptic and the optic, amid the debates over the nature of mimesis that arose in the 19th century. Commissioned by Arthur Balfour in 1875 for the music room of his London residence at 4 Carlton Gardens, the Perseus series was a significant project for Burne-Jones, intended as an immersive, site-specific work. Unfortunately, left incomplete by the artist, the series has struggled to take its proper place as perhaps the defining work of Burne-Jones's career, one that occupied his mind, labor, and studio for well over 20 years. While the second chapter explores Burne-Jones's experimentations with the single monumental painted canvas, this chapter considers the distinctive qualities of the multi-part painted series. Notably, I investigate the kinesthetic properties of the Perseus series, which exceed the individual boundaries of each painting to become an immersive experience. Burne-Jones's mosaic cycle for the American Episcopal Church of St. Paul's Within the Walls, Rome, is the subject of the fourth chapter. This vast decorative scheme presented Burne-Jones with an opportunity to create a prominent public work in an adamantine medium that could not only speak to his own era, but also endure through the ravages of time to inspire future generations. Interpreted as a coherent experiential whole, the Rome mosaics offer a vision of the redemption and salvation of humanity in terms of ecological rebirth. The mosaic cycle alludes to ancient Byzantine precedents, but Burne-Jones infused them with an environmental allegory that progresses from a bleak scene of the Annunciation set in a barren desert to the lush triumph of a verdant tree of life, and at last to a vision of the heavenly Jerusalem as a flourishing paradise. This chapter elucidates Burne-Jones's contribution to nascent ecological thought and protest alongside Ruskin and Morris, illuminating his own reciprocal call for environmental rebirth from the natural devastation of the Industrial Revolution. The concluding chapter adopts a thematic approach, tracing the subjects of the Nativity and the Adoration through key works across Burne-Jones's career and a range of media. Through stained glass, tapestry, oil on canvas painting, and a colossal watercolor, Burne-Jones meditated on the theological doctrine of the Incarnation, which resides at the heart of the Nativity story, as the manifestation of the divine in collective humanity and the natural world. Despite his religious skepticism, I argue that Burne-Jones employed the Christian religious iconography of the Nativity and the Adoration in order to assert the intertwined concepts of manifestation, embodiment, and witness as analogous to the process of artistic labor, contemplation, and revelatory awakening. I demonstrate that the concepts of manifestation, embodiment, and witness emerge as radical and revolutionary commentaries on art and society in modernity through the alchemical alignment of medium and subject. So I'm looking forward to discussing John's outstanding book in dialogue with my own and answering any questions as best I can.
Andrea, thank you. So we do have a few questions beginning to come in, and we'll come to those soon. While others are ruminating on their questions and adding those into the chat, I'd just like to begin with a question for both of you about method. And for the purposes of this group, I want to ask about methods for approaching the study of the interior. Both of you described artists, architects, thinkers who were interested in creating a space that would have a particular effect upon the person experiencing it. So John, the museum was meant to educate. It was meant to be an educational experience as you walked around the museum. And Andrea, you kept talking about spaces that were immersive. You mentioned the kinesthetic effect of the space. And I just wondered if you could both speak to your experience as historians of these spaces. Did you find it an educational building? Did you learn from it as you looked at the architecture? And did you, Andrea, find yourself in these spaces? And obviously not all of them were able to be experienced as interiors, but those that were, did you find that immersive experience created knowledge for you and insight for you in ways that looking at the other kinds of image, other kinds of object didn't? So I'm just interested for both of you to speak about the effects of visiting these spaces and studying these spaces as works that were supposed to act on the viewer and perhaps to act on you as historians.
Shall I take that first? So in terms of the museum, I would say two things in a way about it. It is educative, but it is also supposed to be immersive and kind of personally transformative, because it's conceived as a religious building as well as a scientific building. The two things are together in that concept of natural theology. So that roof that I showed you the picture of is has an extraordinary capacity to draw your eyes up the columns to the vaulted Gothic iron arches and then to the glass roof above. So you're immediately drawn to that moment of kind of well, it's an astonishing space and I would massively encourage any of you who have the opportunity to go and haven't been to take that opportunity. It's really enormously uplifting. So there is a sense in which it transforms you to be there, but there's also a sense in which it is educative, multiply really. As you go around and look at the columns, you can touch them. You can get a sense of the different ways in which different marbles hold heat. You can get a sense of the texture. You can see the fossils embedded in some and not in others. The botanical encyclopedia is educative in that on the bottom floor, each bay is 3 related species. So you can see how a cluster of plants diverge from a type, but are related to one another. The other way in which I find the building educative is that I've been working there and on it for 10 years or more. I still see things that I hadn't previously noticed as I walk around, and they prompt me to think. So that's the other way in which the building educates you, is not only just tells you information, it prompts you to think. So why, for example, are there snakes all around the building? How do the snakes make you think, the carved snakes? Why are there 2 little monkeys tucked into one particular corner? So it's a building that stimulates thought as well as delivering knowledge. So yes, I think it has all 3 of those functions.
That is such a great question, and it's I'm trying to think how best to answer it. I mean, one kind of personal way that I would approach it is that, the origins of this project, which go back very far in my career, was actually when I was in a graduate seminar and I went to Rome and I first saw the mosaics of St. Paul's within the walls. And they have not been written about a lot, in part because of their location, right? That they are in this kind of church away from a lot of upper Victorian art, and it's not really what people go to Rome to see often. And they're also very difficult to photograph. So I was thrilled to get the photographs finally for the book. But before that, they're really difficult to see in reproduction because of the angle and the location. So it really was like being there and experiencing that space, right? Moving through it and then thinking about it, not just as a set or series of images, right? But as this experience of progressing down the nave and moving from one part of the mosaic cycle to the next, and thinking about that as this kind of progression, what that bodily experience would be. Now, obviously, I'm not a 19th century viewer, right? I have my own biases and privileges. And so I can't necessarily say that I experienced things exactly the same as one would back then. But I think it is so important, and it informs so much of what went into my book, right? Things like, progressing down the nave of St. Paul's and the Walls, or experiencing the sun setting at St. Philip's in Birmingham, coming through the Last Judgment window at the end of the day, and just how it kind of lights up that space and makes it this really different experience. Even something like seeing King Cophetua when its frame was restored, and suddenly it became this continuation of the interior throne through this purpose design frame that made it kind of pop out into the space, and then you see it as this kind of threshold. So as much as possible, trying to capture that, and then linking it back to, both the way that Burne-Jones and Morris described their own experience of space, right, very early in their lives when they went to experience the Gothic churches of northern France. That was where they kind of made this moment of deciding, this is what we're going to do. We're going to dedicate our lives to art because of the possibility for epiphanic experience and awakening. But then also thinking about later theorists like Frederick Jameson, someone that Elizabeth Miller has also quoted, in this idea of these kind of creating pockets of stasis, of these little utopian spaces that they can then be these moments of awakening where you kind of step away and through that immersion then have a revelation. And I think it's also kind of what makes someone like Burne-Jones and a lot of the Pre-Raphaelites in general difficult to experience in the museum setting in some ways, right? Because you can't recreate the interior of St. Paul's and the Walls in a museum, so, and that's so central to what they wanted to do. So it's really interesting. And, as we enter this digital age, here we are giving a talk, that's going around the world digitally. It's great to be able to do that, but also, keeping in mind the importance that, in the 19th century, they placed on experiencing an interior in person. And, whether or not we can really recreate that remotely in some ways is a good question.
Thank you both. I'm going to turn next to Tim Rohan, who is one of my fellow board members at HIG, and he is like me in the Events and Conferences Committee. Tim, your question's there in the chat. If you would like to add anything or paraphrase, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, so I wrote out the question in the chat for everyone to see, but just to paraphrase it, it concerns the role of the mural in the interior and other means of media and how it creates an interior space, and was this central to the Pre-Raphaelite agenda? Thank you.
You want to take that one first, Andrew?
Sure, yeah. So, the Pre-Raphaelites, and then extending into, Burne-Jones and Morris, they really wanted these public spaces to do murals. And Burne-Jones writes about this, like how much that's what he really wants, to have these, great public spaces to work in and to have, regular people see them. And so one of the things that, he's often seen as a painter, but actually painting was kind of problematic for him because it could be, taken away and hidden by the wealthy. And he really wanted something that was going to kind of work in a public space. So, for example, the Balfour Commission, it's the fact that it's unfinished is really interesting. Now, I can't say that he intended to leave it unfinished, right? Because Burne-Jones did die fairly young and very suddenly. And so, we have to kind of wonder what he would have ultimately done. But originally, it was supposed to be this kind of a fully immersive, integrated experience in Balfour's residence. And, in my chapter, I really try and think about like, okay, this is an important commission in some ways, like at the heart of the governmental complex of London, right? And so even though it was for a private home, it essentially could function as this kind of semi-public space. It had a dedicated audience. This is something that goes all the way back to the Oxford Union mural project, right, that he did with Rossetti, and that, John, in your book, you pointed out the kind of ties between that project and what's going on at the Natural History Museum. And so, that idea of having these spaces where you could, send a message to a particular audience, and I think depending on the medium and the audience who might have been encountering that, Burne-Jones kind of altered the types of messages and the types of iconography that he was using to kind of suit who that might be oriented towards. Now, the fact that that Balfour Commission was never finished might, in part be just kind of trying to resolve some of the issues of that progression, but it also could be some issues that Burne-Jones had with Balfour as he became increasingly conservative and, kind of politically very much opposed to what Burne-Jones believed. So.
Thanks, Andrea. If I were to pick up, I mean, I'll pick up on that reference, of course, to the Oxford Union project. So the two projects are happening with the same architects and an overlapping group of artists at the same time. So Woodward is building the museum, and then gets the commission to build the Oxford Union Library. Well, it was the original, I think, was the old debating chamber, and then became the library. And in terms of utopianism and the role of the mural, it's kind of really intriguing, because obviously the project at the Union is taken up very enthusiastically by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who then sweeps in Burne-Jones and Morris and others to work with him on that, or sort of inspires them to do so. The murals, the role of murals at the museum is very different, and is partly, as you mentioned in your note, a kind of incomplete thing. There's one design, a rather terrible design, I think, for a mural or potential mural scheme at the museum, which has nothing to do with science. It's sort of unclear whether it's actually it's clearly military. Some from the armor, it might be Civil War, or it might be medieval. So that seems to connect a little bit to the Arthurian project. We have no idea who did that mural design. We don't know why it was rejected, except I mean, one can imagine many reasons why it might have been. But the museum is, like the series you're talking about, Andrea, the museum is unfinished. So there were other decorative elements of a potentially utopian design there. There was going to be a series of quotations around the wall. Along the one that is referenced by Ackland as is consider the lilies of the field. The only one that actually gets there is a quotation from now hang on, it's the Ars Longum Vita Brevis is the Horatian Latin translation. It's actually in the original Greek, but it's carved on Ackland's own fireplace. It's Hippocrates is the source of that. So that would have been a different element. The other thing about murals at the museum is that they so you have the imaginary concept of what the schema might have been. We have one more glimpse of that, which took me forever to track down. It's in the literature on the museum. It's often referred to that Rossetti was supposedly invited to do a mural on Newton gathering pebbles from the shore of the Sea of Knowledge, which is an image that Newton himself used for his own practice. If you can imagine a less Rossettian composition than that, then you're doing better than I can. But it took me ages to find out what the source for that is, and the source is a book by Holman Hunt on the murals in the Oxford Union building from the late, I think 1880s, 1880s, 1890s. I expect that Hunt was making it up. I certainly have no other evidence for it, but you can see that there's an idea of a sort of scientific utopian mural scheme that might have been a kind of glimpse at it. Actually, the only murals are in the geology room, and they're also intriguing because you have to think about how they might have been aids to teaching. They're not terribly precise in their geology. They seem to capture images of the forces of fire. One of them is Mount Vesuvius, and ice. The other is the Mer de Glace. So they seem to be almost emblematic of geological forces and processes, rather than specifically didactic or illustrative.
Thank you. Very, very full answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it was striking how that Ars Longa Vita Brevis was so central to both of your books. And really, as historians of the interior, it helps us to think about the interior as offering all of these people what seems to be the promise of something lasting, something that would be a legacy in a way that almost nothing else could be imagined to be. I'd like to pull out a couple of questions that have a shared theme, although they are asking really different specific questions. This question of modernity and its relationship to the past. So Jude Nixon has asked, does the architecture reflect the changing evolutionary modes of science? And then David Kopp has asked, I'm curious that Ruskin, who along with Morris was an outspoken critic of Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in Hyde Park and its survival in Penge Place, Sydenham, could accept the railway materials of the temple. So I'm just wondering about how important being sort of modernity was, what uses the past or styles of the past were being, what uses were being made of the past, of the beliefs of the past in this present moment. These are both spaces of revival, but they're also spaces that are trying to look to the utopia, to modern science, as you pointed out, John, cutting edge cell theory. Obviously that these two specific questions about changing scientific beliefs and attitudes to the materials, but also anything else you'd like to say about the importance of modernity and its relationship to the past in these case studies.
Shall I take this one first? So on Ruskin and the Crystal Palace analogy, Ruskin wrote a letter to Ackland where he said, you don't want glass, do you? In that case, it's all over. So he was appalled at the idea that there would be glass. He was also, in terms of iron, the use of iron, Ruskin and Skidmore were both firmly in favor of wrought iron and utterly disapproving of cast iron. So Skidmore put in a quote for a cheaper roof that would be held up by wrought iron spandrels, which is the one that fell down literally days after Ruskin gave a talk in support of wrought iron, as it were. So they had to have recourse to cast iron. So you've got this tension between the scientists who are embracing modernity and some of the aestheticians, Ruskin, Skidmore, who are much more have reservations about it. And actually, coming to the question of evolution, Ruskin is an interesting figure there too, because Ruskin has an ongoing relationship with the museum. He comes to teach there as professor, Slade Professor of Fine Art in the 70s, at the end of the 60s into the 70s. And up until then, he's actually quite proud of his association with the museum, and then gets increasingly disillusioned as he sees the museum embracing a more materialist conception of science. And that is basically what happens in terms of the staffing. So the people who found the museum are natural theologians, mostly pretty resistant to evolution. And then increasingly those people either sort of mellow or die, and are replaced by people who are actually really quite more determinedly Darwinistic than a lot of other institutions at the time. So Ruskin, who's a representative of this more natural theological perspective and is also deeply skeptical about Darwin, becomes increasingly in tension with that aspect of modernity. In terms of how it plays out in the structure, I'm just going to give you one example, but you remember I pointed to the arch, the entranceway, and how Pollen's illustrations of the days of creation up the side were never carved. And in fact, actually, the spandrels above that were going to be representing resurrection were never carved. And so Ackland was able to re-narrativize a bas-relief sculpture that was done by a devout Catholic artist, Pollen, in a moment when he would have been firmly natural theological and anti-evolutionist. He's able to re-narrativize that as an evolutionary story by taking the decorative curlicues that work their way up the arch from the figures of Adam and Eve, who he says by this point are purely symbolical, and they lead up to the angel. He takes them as a symbol of evolution and of evolutionary progress to something we don't know what lies beyond the evolutionary future. And of course, we don't know what lies beyond it because it was never carved because the money ran out. So he can fabricate new stories based on the decoration, and Ackland does that as the science changes.
Yes, and there's this quotation that I was thinking about today, you know, and how our two books might dialogue with each other. And this is another kind of, I think, misunderstood quotation attributed to Burne-Jones, which is that he once wrote, "The more materialistic science becomes, the more angels I shall paint," right? Which is sort of presented as Burne-Jones being opposed to science and all of these ideas. And actually, it's the utilitarian aspect, right? The utilitarianism that he's protesting against. So it's not that he rejected science. He's actually, you know, engaged with, you know, cutting edge ideas about science, but he also wants to merge that with religion and also with this other kind of ecological worldview. And I really liked, John, how you were talking about pre-Raphaelitism as the visual language for expressing science. I thought that was so important, you know, understanding this idea of truth to nature and witness as being a way of looking at and engaging with the world. And I think, you know, now as we're really engaging, you know, with these kind of ecological, you know, increasingly, you know, this moment of crisis, of ecological crisis that we're in today, thinking about these kind of alternative models of thinking about the natural world, engaging with and expressing the natural world. So if I might actually kind of sneak in a little question, you know, John, I know that you're kind of working on environmental activism and awareness in the 19th century. And if you might, you know, talk about that a little bit in dialogue with your project, if I may.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I was thinking exactly about that as you were talking.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that truth to nature is it's not only witnessing, it's also valuing.
Yeah.
It's an attentiveness that implies recognizing the value of the things that you are spending so much time painting laboriously or drawing laboriously or carving laboriously. Yes, the work I'm doing really is and this is another reason why I'm now extremely keen to go and read your book, Andrea, is because I'm interested in, I'm working on Ruskin and environmental justice. And collaborating, in fact, with the Guild of St. George, which is the organization he founded, to work on Ruskin and forest ecology, bringing people into forests, getting them to look with a Ruskinian pre-Raphaelite gaze at it, and thinking about how that enables people to think about questions of environmental exclusion and environmental justice. So yes, thank you for raising that.
We have a question that is to John, but also suggests that it may also relate to Andrea's work from Stephen. The museum is encyclopedic, yes, but how much do you think it reflects the pre-Raphaelite, Ruskinian, synecdochical tendency to see the world through bits, through fragments, which do not necessarily cohere? So anything either of you would like to say about relationships between parts and wholes in these case studies?
Yes, definitely. I mean, one of the things about the museum that is so wonderfully suggestive is that it's the product of so many different artists. And Woodward held a kind of a gentle hand of control over the whole thing. But each of these artists does indeed look at a different fragment, as it were. And they do not necessarily all cohere. So one of the impulses of the museum's sculpture, I think, is ecological. That we've talked about natural theology, we've talked about the symbolic element a little bit. That's what I think those snakes are doing, is symbolizing medicine, symbolizing sin, symbolizing ecology in different ways, predation. I've got a PhD student actually at the moment who's coming towards the end of her PhD on the art of the museum. And her kind of, I've tended in my book to sort of bring them together to form a largely but not wholly coherent narrative. But she's very interested in precisely the different impulses and also the different interest groups. So this is one of the ways that when I was working on pre-Raphaelites and science, I had a chapter on this museum and a chapter on the Natural History Museum in London. And whenever I went to one, I thought, this is wonderful. And whenever I went to the other one, I thought, no, this is wonderful. Of course, they're both wonderful buildings, but the classic distinction between them is that the London Museum is really the product of one scientist, Owen, working with one artist, architect, Alfred Waterhouse, really, in terms of the creative impulse. So it's far more coherent and therefore far more limited in a way. Whereas the Oxford Museum has precisely that, reveling in the fragmentary, the bits, the details, the particular things that catch your eye that you're mentioning in your question, Stephen.
Yeah, and I think, that relationship of part to whole, right? Paying attention to one little part in order to gain awareness of the greater, picture. It reminds me in some ways actually of the approach I take to the monumental painting King Cophetua and the Beggar Maid, right? Where in some ways it is such an overwhelming painting, and in scale, in tactility, and again, this is one when you really see it in person, you get a sense for the kind of layers that are built up there on the canvas and the ways in which all these details are building on each other. And it really is the kind of the grasp of the king on the crown, right? His hands holding the weight of that crown in his fingers, that you as a viewer, kind of, especially since it's positioned at eye level, you come back to that. And that kind of moment, that, part of it that then stands in for this greater whole, like that's how you kind of come to terms with the entire message, right? That all of it can be condensed into that moment of kind of weighing that golden crown in his hands and the cost and the symbolism of that crown, and kind of relating that then to this need to set beauty free. So yeah, I think that idea of kind of paying attention and of witness and of kind of awakening comes through that, even thinking about like, Elizabeth Pratchard's interpretation of Millet and the reeds that appear in Ophelia, right? Paying attention to those little parts then teaches you how to see the greater whole.
And in both cases, we also see the interest in really paying attention to these minute details. Like Andrea, you were writing about how Burne-Jones was choosing the individual tesserae for the mosaics, like just really paying this very close attention. But then also it is a collaborative work, so it's a sort of how to negotiate the difference between the designer's vision and the need to rely on craftspeople who can execute the work. We have a question from Tracy, who asks, John, I'm curious if there are any non-Western influences to the architecture of the museum. Morris himself was inspired by non-Western design.
Disappointingly, I think probably not. The museum that Woodward built immediately before and kind of concurrently was the Trinity College Dublin Museum building. And that certainly has more sort of Eastern Mediterranean Byzantine influences coming into play there. The Oxford Museum, I think if you were to find it at all, it would be in some of the non-illustrative decorative details. You might see a trace of it in some of Henry Swan's work, perhaps in the Entomology Museum, some of the door handles and things of that sort, but nothing that you can clearly say, as you can with, for example, Morris's tapestries and carpets. Nothing you can see definitely. I had wondered whether those two monkeys might be an allusion to the three wise monkeys, because one of them is covering its eyes and one of them is, or burying its head in its hand, and one of them is has its hand over its mouth. But I could find no evidence that the story of the three wise monkeys was known in Western Europe before about the 1890s. So sadly, I had confected this idea that maybe the monkey who could hear no evil was you, as it were. You were the third monkey in that triad because of the dialogue around monkey ancestry at the Great Debate, and I think that probably is what inspired the carvings. But sadly, I don't think it's actually a non-Western story being brought into the museum.
We have a second question from David Kopp, which I'll read. He writes, Andrea, first, your book is wonderful. I just finished it yesterday. I found it interesting that Burne-Jones refused to do the mosaics for the domes of London St. Paul's, a building, by the way, which was hated for its pretend architecture going all the way back to William Cobbett. Wouldn't he see that project as an opportunity to teach and preach social reform to those who regarded as their parish church of mercantile commerce? If that was his object, for art to transform, it seems to me that would have been an excellent commission.
Yes, thank you so much, David, for that question. And it is one of those opportunities that he really struggled with, right? And he writes about, kind of being offered that and kind of wrestling with whether or not he wanted to accept it. And in the end, he just couldn't do it. In part because the architecture, but also, examples like the St. Philip's in Birmingham, right? He was able to work with an architecture that was not, Gothic revival. But it was the idea that it was not, it was a religious institution dedicated to Mammon, right? He literally writes that, right? That there's the common book of prayer that's practiced there is one that is, praying to the god of the stock market and to Mammon. And he just couldn't reconcile that. He saw the way in which, art could be co-opted by the rich and the elite. And he saw that as, basically he would be contributing to that no matter what he put there. Now, other commissions that he did accept, Balfour, the Holy Grail tapestries that he created for the dining room of William Knox Darcy, who was a gold mining magnate and later a founder of British Petroleum. He accepted that commission. So, he certainly could at times, work maybe against, in some ways, the interests of a patron, trying to introduce what one of my students called the Trojan horse idea of kind of introducing this concept that then subtly and slowly over time would kind of awaken the patron to maybe the error of their ways. But it is kind of a missed opportunity, right, that he could have had those mosaics there and what they would have been like and how much better known they would have been than the ones that are, in Rome, the commission that he did accept. The Star of Bethlehem, monumental watercolor that he created for Birmingham, I think is another one of those examples of speaking specifically to an urban industrial audience and kind of trying to bring some of these messages together. So he did sometimes, accept those commissions with an element of compromise, but didn't in that case.
There is one more question in the chat, which I'll read to you. This is from Anne Bird, who writes, John, were the materials and encyclopedic natural elements decorating the column capitals in the museum part of the didactic program, or did they serve to create an immersive experience in addition to various museum displays? Was the building itself the major teaching tool?
So yes, they were part of the didactic program. The columns actually are still used for teaching, and I mean the physical sample columns, but the columns are all inscribed, so they tell you exactly what geological period they come from, where in the British Isles they come from. The carvings at the top on the ground floor, so the capitals and corbels on the ground floor, were catalogued by John Phillips. John Phillips, who was the first keeper, decided on the schema for them, and they were included in the first guidebook to the museum. So you could wander around the museum, and as well as looking at the specimens and being told what they were in your guidebook, you could also look up at the carvings and be told what they were. The carvings on the first floor were mostly not done until the Edwardian period, when again the money ran out after about 6 of those were carved, and then they got another big donation in the Edwardian period, and it was decided to carve the upper floor as a memorial to Ruskin. And although they're much less they are botanically precise, but they're large clusters, large categories of plants rather than more sort of carefully taxonomized. So they don't really have an educative purpose. But I think everything there is at once educative and immersive. Nothing is one but not the other. Actually, also just to say the wrought iron capitals are also particular. Some of them are particular plants. Certainly, the wrought iron spandrels are.
Thank you both very much for a really stimulating conversation. Please don't go away, anybody, because I want to call on Jude Nixon, the president of the William Morris Society in the United States, to tell us a little bit about the society. Over to you, Jude.
Thanks, Imogen. And I am getting a feedback here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. It's a little echoey, but
Yeah,
we can hear you.
I'm getting a feedback. How is this? No? Okay. Imogen, you do it then.
Okay, Jude, sorry. Well, if you would like to become a member of the William Morris Society in the United States, I have put the link to our membership page in the chat. You may or may not know that we recently became an affiliated society of CAA, and we regularly have a session at the CAA conference. And we have an upcoming event that may be of interest, which is very relevant to what we have been talking about today. We have our annual meeting, which is on Sunday, March 19th at 4:30 Eastern Time. It is where we conduct our society business, but Sarah Waters will be presenting about the digital catalogue raisonné for Edward Burne-Jones at that event. So a great opportunity to find out more about Burne-Jones there and to meet other Morris scholars and enthusiasts. And I will also ask Tim Rohan, if you would mind just saying a few words about the Historic Interiors Group.
Hi there. Yeah, hi, I'm Tim Rowan from the Historic Interiors Group. I chair the events committee with Imogen and Angelica Ponzio. I want to introduce you to the Historic Interiors Group, known as HIG. It's an affiliate group within the US-based Society of Architectural Historians. HIG is dedicated to raising awareness of the significance of interiors as a field of inquiry unto itself. We advance this mission through events such as this book talk, live events, we are actually live at times, such as a tour we did last weekend of the Rethought American Wing period rooms at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We have upcoming a panel that we've endorsed about religious objects in the interior at the Society of Architectural Historians meeting in Montreal this April. So please join us there. We'll probably also have a social event. We regularly hold forums online about subjects such as teaching the interior. We support the work of graduate students who work on interiors with an online conference as well. Transnational and transhistorical, we are a resource for everyone interested in the history of the interior. To learn more about HIG and join our group, please go to this link in the chat, and I will try and do that right now, or pass it on to Imogen. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. And then there it goes to Imogen. Yes.
Great, thanks, Tim. And your very full description of HIG reminds me to just let everyone know that the William Morris Society has recently introduced a new student award for students writing about William Morris or anything related to Morris. So please check out our website and share that with students that might be interested. We just a really great opportunity for the students. And then we also have a fellowship, which will be advertised later in the year. Thank
Imogen,
you, everybody.
Imogen, do you mind if I just mention another society or group that might interest you?
Of course.
Which is, it's called Symbiosis, and I'll put in the link in the chat. But we're a network for the role of the art, kind of cultivating and fostering and researching the role of the arts in natural history museums specifically. So we have periodic conferences. You can see details of events and publications, but essentially, if you're interested in interior in a particular context of museum spaces and natural history museum spaces, especially, we're having our next meeting in Oxford in England in September. But any of you, particularly on the HIG side, who are interested in that, feel free to get in touch with me, and I can provide you with more information. And similarly, if any of you, I know it's a long way away for most of you, but if any of you find yourselves in Oxford and want a tour of the museum, do please look me up.
Yes.
Amazing. Thanks, John. Well, I think it remains only to thank again everyone who was involved in organizing this event. Many of you are here thank you for your support, and to thank Andrea and John for sharing their work. I hope we can continue this conversation offline, in person, next time we meet at conferences. And I hope that many of you will participate in future HIG and William Morris Society events. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.